After leaving Britain after his father's death, Knut traveled to Denmark, planning on becoming king to raise a new army to return and conquer England. In Denmark, Knut was in for a rather unpleasant surprise. The fact is that the brother of Knut, Harald II, has already been elected the new king of Denmark. Since the main goal of Knut was the conquest of England, he decided not to fight with his brother, but instead invited him to divide the Danish kingdom into two parts and conquer England together. What exactly Harald replied to his brother is not known, as historians differ on whether Knut received help from his brother or not. Meanwhile, in 1015, a conflict broke out in England between King Ethelred II and his heir, Edmund Ironside. The fact is that Ethelred, with the participation of his advisor to the ealdorman of Mercia, Edric Striona, executed two lords of the northern regions for helping Sweyn Forkbeard. In turn, Edmund Ironside stood up for the executed and, having married the widow of one of the executed lords, occupied his lands. When news of this reached Knut, he hastily loaded all the assembled detachments onto ships and sailed towards England. Some time later, the army of the Danes under the command of Knut landed on the English coast and, breaking the resistance of local troops, plundered Kent. At this time, Ethelred II became seriously ill, so he entrusted the defense of the kingdom to Edmund Ironside. It should be mentioned that Edmund Ironside had a conflict with the ealdorman of Mercia, Edric Striona, who, having learned that the command of the army was entrusted to Edmund Ironside, went over to the side of the Danes along with his people. Having lost a significant part of his army, Edmund was forced to hastily retreat and take refuge behind the city walls of London. Thus, by the beginning of 1016, the Danes managed, practically without encountering serious resistance, to establish control over a significant part of Wessex and Mercia. The inhabitants of Wessex, who were worried about their lives and health by the arrival of the Danish army, recognized Knut as king. Already at the beginning of 1016, the Danish army continued its offensive and began to establish control over the central counties of Mercia. Meanwhile, Edmund hastily gathered a militia. As a result, he managed to gather a rather impressive army, but she refused to fight the Danes, saying that they would go into battle only under the command of the king. At this time, the King of England was seriously ill and would almost die, so there was no one to resist the army of the Danes. Edmund had no choice but to disband the militia, which still refused to fight without a king, and hastily go to Northumbria to seek help from the local ealdorman Uhtred. In turn, Uhtred was in no hurry to fight the Danes, but at the same time he agreed with Edmund to destroy the possessions of Striona, who had previously gone over to the side of Knut. Having received the news that the main forces of Edmund and Uhtred were involved in the ruin of the possessions of Striona, Knut decided to take advantage of the favorable situation. He advanced into Northumbria at the head of his army. When the Danish army reached Northumbria, Uhtred, who was afraid of losing his possessions, immediately left Edmund and recognized the supreme power of Knut. After Uhtred left Edmund with his people, he hastily retreated to London under the protection of its walls. On April 23, 1016, Ethelred II died and the English nobility, having gathered in London, proclaimed Edmund Ironside the new King of England. It should be noted that only the nobility of southern England recognized Edmund as king, while northern England was under the control of Knut and the local nobility managed to swear allegiance to him. Upon learning of the death of Ethelred, Knut at the head of his army began to move towards London and on May 7, 1016, having reached its environs, began to lay siege to the city. Despite the fact that Knut acted swiftly, Edmund managed to leave London and, having reached Wessex, began to collect the militia. In this situation, Knut had to send part of his army in order to defeat the English militia. This decision proved unsuccessful, as the Danes sent to Wessex failed to defeat the numerically superior English militia, and they were forced to retreat. Meanwhile, the siege of London continued, and since the city was well defended, and Knut did not have siege engines, he could not take the city. For this reason, Knut ordered his men to lift the siege and, dividing his army into several parts, ordered them to sack southern England. In turn, Edmund, while the Danes plundered southern England, tried to organize an uprising against Knut in the part of Wessex controlled by him. Upon learning of this, Knut laid siege to London again. Since Knut did not have siege engines during the sack of southern England, the new siege of London also turned out to be unsuccessful. After the Danes lifted the siege of London, they were attacked by the army of Edmund, who managed to gather a fairly large force. Unfortunately, it is not known exactly how the battle took place, but after its completion, Knut, together with his army, was forced to retreat to the Isle of Sheppey, which was located at the mouth of the Thames. At this time Edric Striona decided that luck had turned against Knut, so he, along with his people, left the army of the Danes and went over to the side of Edmund. Thus, Knut found himself in a very difficult situation, since after the betrayal of Striona, the British had an overwhelming numerical advantage. In addition, the Danish army had not yet had time to recover from the unsuccessful sieges of London. Realizing that he could not defeat the enemy's army with the available forces, Knut ordered his army to begin a retreat to northern England, planning to return with strength and defeat Edmund's army. In turn, Edmund was well aware that he would not have a more suitable chance to defeat the army of the Danes. Therefore, having gathered all the forces available to him, he set off in pursuit of Knut in order to prevent the Danes from reaching their ships. Edmund was well aware that he had an overwhelming numerical advantage on his side, so he was confident in his victory. The English army quickly overtook the army of the Danes near the village of Assandun. The Anglo-Saxon army, having overtaken the enemy, tried to cut it off from the coast so that the Danes could not board their ships and retreat to northern England. In turn, the Danes, having reached the environs of Assandun, saw the enemy, who, blocking their path, began to form battle formations. Knut, knowing about the numerical superiority of the enemy, was well aware that he could not retreat. The fact is that his people were tired after a long military campaign, and their food supplies were running out. Thus, the chances that he, along with his army, could reach northern England by land were minimal. Therefore, Knut decided to attack the enemy, planning to win or die. Having formed battle formations, the Danes began the attack, slowly approaching the enemy. When the Danes came within firing range, they came under a hail of arrows fired by the English archers. Covered with shields, the Danes continued to move forward, realizing that they would not be able to retreat. As the Danish troops approached, Edmund ordered his men to launch an attack. The Anglo-Saxon wars were rapidly attacking down the hillside. Despite the powerful onslaught of the English infantry, the Danes still managed to maintain their battle formations. A bloody hand-to-hand fight ensued. The Danes fought desperately, knowing full well that if they could not get through to their ships, they would simply die. Despite the fury with which the Danes fought, the Anglo-Saxons had an overwhelming numerical advantage. Therefore, after some time, the Anglo-Saxons began to push the enemy. The victory of the British seemed to be a matter of time, but at this time Edric Striona, along with his people, stopped fighting and left the battlefield. This was the turning point of the battle, as the British lost their advantage in numbers. Taking advantage of this, the Danes began to push the enemy, who suffered huge losses. Very soon the victory of the Danes became obvious and Edmund, along with the remnants of his army, fled from the battlefield. This battle was a real disaster for Edmund, as a huge number of Anglo-Saxon nobility died in the battle. Nevertheless, the Danes also suffered huge losses in battle. In order to continue the conquest of England, Knut needed fresh forces, which he did not currently have. Therefore, he agreed to peace negotiations. Knut and Edmund concluded a peace treaty under which Knut received all the territories located north of the Thames, and the lands south of the Thames remained under Edmund's control. Edmund also agreed to pay Knut Danegeld. Thus, after the conclusion of peace in England, two kingdoms were formed. North under the control of Knut and south which remained under the rule of Edmund. However, this state of affairs did not last long. On November 30, 1016, Edmund suddenly dies. Many historians agree that Edmund did not just die, but was killed on the orders of Knut. Contenders for the throne of the southern part of England were Edmund's brother, Edwig, as well as the sons of the late king, Edward and Edmund. At the same time, the English nobility were well aware that Canute would not refuse to conquer all of England, so they decided to avoid senseless bloodshed and elect Canute as king of southern England. Thus, in December 1016, the Witenagemot proclaimed Canute king of England. Having become the sole ruler of England, Canute immediately decided to strengthen his power. He was well aware that if the children of Edmund did not pose a particular threat to his power, then the children of Ethelred from Emma of Normandy, Edward, and Elfred, who at that time were in Normandy, could well claim the English throne with the support of the Duke of Normandy Richard II. Canute was a smart man, so he solved this problem very gracefully. In the summer of 1017, he married Emma of Normandy, promising that the children born of this marriage would receive the English throne. Thus, it was not Richard II, not Emma of Normandy herself, who even made any attempts to place Ethelred's sons on the English throne. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so as not to miss new videos.